All right, everybody. Um, so I just returned from a trip to Rwanda, and shortly after I was there, I realized that I did not pack enough sketchbook, and that I was very quickly going to run out of sketchbook paper. And so I started thinking, well, what can I, if I'm not going to buy a new sketchbook here, then I'd better save paper. So I usually just draw in pencil, and on my sketchbook, I will only draw on one side, because I don't want, when I close the book, those two pages to smudge on each other. With soft pencil, one page smudges on the other. You'll find this is particularly true if you have a spiral-bound book, but even on a sewn-binding book, you get some smudging over. And I was thinking, if I started drawing in pen, well then, maybe I could, I would have twice as much paper. I could draw on both pages. And I looked around to try to find one of these sort of fancy sketching pens and these things that I'd read about, and sort of went online and sort of, what sort of pens are, well, and I couldn't really find any of those in Kigali. But I did find lots of just regular Bic ballpoint pens. And so I brought one of those out into the field with me and started messing around with it, fully expecting to not have it work for me. But within a day, I fell head over heels in love with Bic ballpoint pens. And just like the cheapest possible pen that you could buy. And so what I want to do today is show you some possibilities and openings. I know that you've been doing ballpoint pen stuff for years. It's your go-to tool. I didn't get it. I didn't get it. So, yes? F2?
I can see. Sticker on it too.
Test.
Yeah, but it's weak.
Okay. Let's see. Do I have? I'll have it pointing up towards my head instead of pointing down towards my shoes. We'll rewind from the start. So, just everybody, pretend you're surprised by my witty banter. Which end opens? Okay. I was just getting cavalier with a lavalier.
Very good.
Is this better now? Testing.
No, it's back to
Okay, let's try this.
my dad will hold one arm up.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like that old tailor joke, you know? The guy says, the suit doesn't fit. He says, well, put your arm like this. And then he says, yeah, but the leg's too long. He says, well, walk like this. And he says, yeah, but the back isn't right. He says, well, walk like this. And he starts walking down the street, and the one guy says, man, that guy's infirm. He says, yeah, but look at his coat. He's got a really good tailor.
What about now? Are we good?
Yeah,
We're good? All right. So getting started. Let's play with ballpoint pens today. When I was on my recent trip to Rwanda, I made the mistake of not bringing enough sketchbook with me. This was an impending disaster for me. So I usually draw in pencil and just draw on the right-hand side of the page, because when the book closes, I don't want the two sides to smudge on each other. But I realized if I could draw on both sides, I would have twice as much sketchbook with me, and maybe I could make it all the way through the 2 months. So I can't do that with my graphite pencil because of the smudging problem. I decided let's give a try on sketching with a ballpoint pen. And initially I looked around for fancy art sketching pens, But in Kigali, all I could find was a bunch of these Bic pens. And so I decided, let's give this a shot. And I brought a Bic pen out with me into the field, the cheapest, most inexpensive pen that you could buy, like the Bic round stick. And within half a day, I was in love with sketching with ballpoint pens. And so, John, you've put some of your sketches on our Facebook page. You're sketching with a ballpoint pen all the time, and I never really got it, the degree to which it gives you incredible flexibility.
You want to carry all the pens, pencils, and erasers, and all the handy that sponge problem. You just don't have to do that anymore. You need one pen.
It doesn't smudge.
No.
And depending on the, see, I thought that old pens were basically the same thing. And yeah, sure, there's some that have the flexible nib, so you can, but those really flexible nib ones seem to leak more. And what bugged me about them is with lots of pens, as you lighten your pressure, you get the same sort of heavy, thick line, which is great if you're signing checks or writing a letter. But with a pencil, as you go lighter with the pencil, as you draw more lightly, you get lighter gray lines. And it turns out with some of the ballpoint pens out there, as you go more lightly, you get the same effect. It was a revelation for me that I could get these sort of dark to light effects with a pen. I never knew that was possible. And I know that there are a lot of people who have been kind of on this for a while, but for me, this was a totally new game. And it turns out that what you want to do is just start messing, not all pens work the same way. And sitting around your house somewhere is going to be a pen that works. Now, you may have brought one with you. I've got a bunch of, I rated my house for pens, so if you do a test with your pen and you find that it is the same darkness as you lighten up, again, this is great for writing. But for the sort of sketching we're going to be doing today, what we want to leverage is trying to find a pen that as we go lighter pressure with it, the pen will give us a lighter, ghosty line. And so what you're going to want to do is, if one of these pens, very often these things that just look like the real cheap pen, these seem to do a great job of working with this. So if you, so, all right, so grab a little handful of these, all right, and see if there's one here that you like that works for you. And what you want to do is just a little pressure test. You're going to go press hard, lighten up. And if it stays the same darkness all the way through, put that one aside. Try the next one. Press hard, lighten up. And if you get dark to very pale, then you've got a pen that's going to work for this. Let me know if you like one of the pens that I brought from home, you get to bring it home with you. You can try them out. Does anybody want to try a different pen? I'll put more options right over here. So first do a little bit of experimenting. You actually might want to try a few different pens. If you've got one that's working with you, I find ones with a really sharp, fine tip, I don't like the feeling of that on the paper as much. Ones with a sort of a medium tip seems to roll and flow across it. You got the Bic round stick there. So there's some more here if you want to mess with them. Do you want to play with some others? You got your favorite? So John, you've been doing stuff with these pens for a while. What is the one that is your favorite?
Well, actually, the one that's my favorite is from the hotel in Reno.
The Reno Hotel.
It's the Silver Legacy Hotel.
So the Silver Legacy Hotel. So you go to that hotel.
I just picked them up. And
Yep. So yeah, that's what I found too. This is, so I've got, here's the Papermate Wright Brothers Pilot Easy Touch Switch for me, and here's the complimentary pen I picked up in a hotel. And they actually want you to bring them with you because you're going around with a little advertisement for that hotel. That's why they hand them out. So it's not a bad thing to sort of take those with you. But the other great thing about this is that some of the cheapest pens, the ones you get as complimentary gifts ever, they're dynamite for this little gradation. And if you lose it or it runs out of ink, you just go into another hotel. You're okay. Right? Every once in a while, you're going to check into a Motel 6. You'll be fine. And how many art supplies do you get in hotels all across the country? So does everybody have one that is working for them at this point? All right. So if you, I'll take these. Are these ones?
I have one of yours.
Okay, great. So I'll take these ones and I'll put them over here. If you want to experiment with some of these other ones after class, you're welcome to. You just want to sort of mess with several of them, or go into the art supply store. They have that little pad there where you can test out pens. Test them before you go. Do the pressure test, and if you like it, again, I find that the ones with a very fine tip kind of grip the paper, scratch the paper a little bit too much, and I can't get, when I really want a dark line, a bold dark line, when I push hard with those, it doesn't give me the oomph that I want. But how nice that some of the best ones are the least expensive. Now let's just sort of experiment with the line. You want to sort of see if you can make a series of, give it sort of some punch and sort of see what it's like when you press hard, go all the way. What are the lightest lines that you can make? Give that a try with your pen. And what you're going to do is just sort of start to get used to the way that this pen plays. How lightly can you make lines? Once you've goofed with that a little bit, now just play with line variation. Take one line and see if you can go from light to dark to light again. All right. Can you make a line with a punch in it? And then try going back on top of some of those lines by giving something a couple of strokes. You can make a bolder line, and then just a single stroke makes a lighter line. Then how light can you go out? And then try, when you get to the end of your line, when you get to the faintest line you can, see if you, just by stuttering that line, kind of dance it along to make it peter out even more. So there's a lot of line variation that you get just by that pen. And there are like flexible nib pens will, on the same pen, as you press, they will make sort of wide and soft. These ones you just bear down on that. There's no flexible nib moving, but you still get a surprising amount of line variation. On these sort of heavier lines, I got those by going back over a line that I had already drawn. So line variation is an important element in your sketching. Oh, and by the way, in this workshop is primarily kind of messing with this sort of techniques with the pen. Other workshops we do are more about kind of the anatomy of insects and how to draw them. So this one is more kind of technique centered. There will be at the end a little bit of kind of applying this to landscapes and birds and those sorts of things. But primarily what we're going to be doing is just looking at a bunch of different ways that you can use this pen. And then we'll be applying it in a few little case studies. So line variation is trick number one. In addition to line, what we want to be able to do with our sketches is add areas of tone. So the darks, the lights. And with a pen like this, you can get sort of areas by, lightly rubbing it. Another very common approach to getting value with a pen is hatching and cross-hatching. So hatching is just a bunch of parallel lines. And the deal with hatching is that the closer and lighter they are together, the more people read it as an area of tone, as opposed to seeing it as a bunch of separate lines. The more spread out from each other, the more people start to read, oh, line, 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 as opposed to reading that as an area of tone. With hatching, people tend to try to keep these lines parallel to each other and approximately the same distance apart. If there are lines that are kind of bumping into each other with gaps, this becomes more visually confusing to people, the person who's looking at your drawing. And so what you want to do, just as a little doodling study, is just on the side of your paper, see if you can make a set of parallel lines and not have places where you get them too close. And the more you kind of work at it, the better you're going to get at it. You're going to find that if you're doing this at a table, where you can put your wrist on the table, that stabilization of having your wrist on the table or your wrist on your sketchbook really helps you make a set of short parallel lines. If you're at a table and can anchor your elbow down, you can make a set of parallel lines that are a little bit longer, moving from your elbow. But if your hand is sort of floating in the air and you've got your sketchbook on your knee and you're trying to do these, you'll find you get this one is like this one's like this. That's just, so the more kind of a stable base you get when you're making your hatching lines, that is helpful. This mostly comes into play for us as field sketchers, because how often, every once in a while there's a picnic table out there and we're at a table, but very often we've got our, you've got your sketchbook in one hand and you're kind of doing this on the fly. Just realize that getting longer parallel lines becomes logistically more difficult. When I was a kid, I got these wonderful Stokes animal behavior guides. There's a series by Donald and Lillian Stokes of these nature guides to the behavior of animals that I absolutely loved as a kid. And these were illustrated by Deborah Prince. And I found online a video that she made about cross-hatching. And in this, she had a brilliant idea about how to be able to kind of draw longer lines with your hatching. And you can find this, just do a quick YouTube search. So friends at home, just kind of click over to the other button and you'll be able to find this wonderful video. And I'll kind of encapsulate just a couple of the really great ideas that I gleaned from this that I thought were really high percentage. She's sort of finding that if you're trying to make sort of a hatched area, and you then come along back on top of the line that you were doing before and kind of continue that on, that like you see right here, and here there'll be these sort of blips in your line. And people will pick up on these and they look like a mistake because they're just kind of almost right? So something that's a little bit off, our brain picks it up. Something that is clearly off looks intentional. And so when she wants to make a set of longer lines, instead of taking her first line and doing that and then moving her hand and making her second line and kind of picking that up, you see that little kind of irregularity right there? What she does is she just makes a bunch of lines, but where they end, actually first of all, before she puts her cross-hatching lines, if she's going to be doing a large area, she gets out a pencil. We could do this with our non-photo blue pencil. And she just makes a couple of really kind of light guidelines. And then as she's hatching along, she's got a reference point to kind of bring her back into what is parallel. And otherwise, there's sort of this direction creep that you can get. And we'll be looking at intentionally doing that later. But if you're trying to keep them parallel, a few little non-photo blue pencil lines are going to be really helpful. Then she puts in her lines and staggers where the ends of them are. So they're not all kind of stopping at the same point. And then she's going to come along from the tips of each of these, gives a little gap, and then comes on from there. So what she's doing is giving a little space and then continuing with the line. So she is intentionally leaving these little holes, and it just brings a little bit of sparkle into that drawing. It looks like you're doing it on purpose. Lets a little bit of light into that hatching area. And you'll notice that where the little lines end parallel to each other, you get these sort of more noticeable lines across it. That's why she is having these initial lines be at different heights, so that you don't get one line right across it where all of your little lines end. I thought that idea of, we'll call this princing your line, that little space and then continue. That's a really good idea. It allows you to make larger hatched areas. For things that you want to have less detail on and drop into the background, having one line direction for your hatching lines is a really, really good idea. The less detail there is in an area, the more it sort of drops into the background. And so you can have less interest, less sort of detail by kind of keeping your hatching really, really simple, one direction. But for foreground elements, you can also use these hatching lines to suggest the planes of different objects. So if I have a hi there. Here's a line on this piece of paper. All right? And hold your pencil up so that you cover that line. All right? Hold your pencil up so you cover that line. Now notice when I turn the angle of this clipboard, to keep that line covered, you would have to change the angle of your line. As the direction of this plane changes, the direction of that line, as you see it, it's still going straight down. If I put a water drop on here, it would roll down this way. But from where you are, you're seeing that as a line at that angle. Right? When it's pointing straight towards you, you see that as a vertical. When it's pointing off this way, you see it as a line that way. So the idea is that the direction of a line on some plane that you're trying to represent can say something about the direction, which way that surface is pointing. So here we go. Here are a bunch of geometric shapes. And what I've done is drawn lines that would follow the path that a raindrop would take. So if a raindrop landed on the side of this cube, it would roll straight down. And if it landed here on the side of the dodecahedron, it would come down like that. One that landed here would come like that. And if, instead of dripping onto the ground here, it's stuck to the side of the dodecahedron, this is actually the direction that gravity would take it straight down. It's at an angle from your viewpoint, just as this is at an angle to your viewpoint, even though, from my point of view, this is the fall of gravity right here. But from your angle, you're seeing that from your position, you're seeing that line being at an angle. So this is done with a graphite pencil, but you can see here, this is a vertical surface. This part here is cutting in at an angle like that, and the direction of these strokes changes. I call this contour shading, where you're following the contours with your shading lines. I do this with pencil when my pencil lines show through. With pen, your pen lines will show through even more, especially your first set of hatching lines. If you're going to choose a direction for them, why not have that direction say something about the angle of the plane that you're drawing? So this is coming down like this, and it's cutting in like that. These lines are coming here, and they're changing direction like that. You don't have to memorize some formula. what you want to do when you're out there, you're looking at the rock, is just hold your hand up and imagine you're putting your hand on the surface of that rock. So if I was looking at that rock that was there, and you can sort of feel your way around that rock, and then I just look at what is the direction that, that little crack between my fingers. If I'm holding my hand on that plane here, that line is coming down like that. Okay, I'm going to make my lines in that angle. So you're going to train yourself to see those angles. And if you really wonder, just walk up to the rock, drop some water on it, and see which way it goes, and then come on back and sketch it from your distance again. Hard if it's El Capitan across the other side of the valley. But and if you're interested in this illustration is part of a step-by-step series on one of the blogs on my website on drawing rocks, step-by-step, and they'll take you through kind of putting this all together from the cracks to the little accent points and a few of the subtleties of that if you kind of want to take this further. But it also describes these sort of contour shading lines in there as well. That's hatching. If I want to make an area look darker, I can make my hatching lines closer together. Another thing that I can do, though, is to take a second set of hatching lines and superimpose it over the first set. So if there are two sets of hatching lines crossing over, that's called cross-hatching. So cross-hatching, two sets of lines here. And there's a couple of general rules of thumb with cross-hatching. Ashok taught me this. He says, diamonds are a hatcher's best friend. What he's saying is that you notice that these little shapes here, there's these little diamonds, not squares. I want to get little diamonds so that the direction of one of these lines makes an X where one angle is smaller, one is larger. I want to avoid hatching at right angles. When I do, I get this sort of window screen effect. If I go at right angles, I get this window screen effect, which can be very visually distracting and doesn't really look organic on things. Another place I can get into trouble with hatching is if I have one set of lines hatched with another, and they're very, very close to each other in their angle. When you do this, you'll start to create these sort of odd zones of stripes and spaces. So that's just by changing the angle. They're too close to each other. There'll be big gaps, and all those gaps will line up. And then there'll be places where you're actually crossing over, or actually the in-between spaces where they cross over, that is where you'll find those big gaps. In the spaces between those, that's where we'll find these little darker. So you get this sort of zebra stripe effect rather than a smooth area of tone. So we get this zebra. So just go for those diamonds or the X's, and you'll be in much better shape. If you have a hard time putting long lines over an area and you're that it sort of sends you off, if it's easier for you to make just a series of smaller lines, another way of hatching is patch hatching. Where I really like the effect that you get with this, where what you can do is put one set of little hatch lines next to another, and you just change direction. Here's number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. And I'm going to try to avoid having one set of hatch lines really cross over the other, because then I get into this little kind of darker ribbon right here where I've cross-hatched. So I'm going to try to get these roughly to end here, but I can fill up a space very, very quickly with these. And this is a great little exercise to practice if you're bored in a meeting or in a board meeting. Oh, and by the way, the research on doodling during meetings shows that those doodlers actually have some better memory and retention of what's going on. If you're kind of wondering about what are you saying, there's a great TED Talk by Suni Brown, and you can check that out, the TED Talk on doodling. So another thing for you YouTubers to do a search for. So you can sit there in your little meeting, and you're just sort of getting familiar, and you discover that you can actually really fill up an area with an area of even tone very, very quickly with this. And you get this really interesting effect. So I'd say this approach and the contour demonstrating hatching approach are some of the ones that I use the most. If you want to get this darker, then start patch hatching with cross hatching. So here are a bunch of, so I'm just putting another layer of patch hatching on top of that first set. And I can actually build that up with another layer, boop, another layer, boop. And when you get out to this far out, you don't even have to worry about, what angle are you at? Is that at a right angle or not? Because it's so dark in here, you can't really tell. Out in this area, it does show a little bit. Like, see, there's some squares in there. I like to try to avoid that. This is fast and gives you also a lot of control over how you are adding value and dark. You can say, this little place here, I want to make that a little darker, add a little patch hatch into there, another little patch hatch into there, and you can incrementally change the values on your sketch. We looked at how, if there was a flat surface, you could show the direction of those planes with the direction of your lines. Another thing you'll encounter a lot, though, in nature is rounded forms, from tree trunks to granite domes to boulders and these sorts of things. As you're trying to wrap to deal with these with hatching, it's a rounded shape, so we can use rounded lines. We want to first just sort of back up and think about how do lines curve on a rounded surface. These are a series of latitude and longitude lines, and I've got these on my website if you want to download them, and I'll link them to a blog post related to this. You want to look at how these lines wrap around a sphere, kind of seen from a little bit of a canted angle. If you look at this from the pole, the view isn't very interesting. If you look at this one, from the side, the view isn't very interesting. But you start to tilt these things and rotate them around, and you start to see some very kind of cool things about how the line comes down straight and then hooks in at the end. How these ones down here, sort of they hook in on these U's. What I found to help me kind of get some of these angles sort of intuitively, mechanically into my head, after I carefully plotted this out, I just printed it out on, I did this with, it took a long time in kind of looking at diagrams and globes and these sorts of things. And then what I did is I printed it out on a piece of paper and put a piece of tracing paper over it and just traced over that little drawing about 20 times. And repeating that kind of got those sort of motions and angles more intuitively into my head. And so now when I'm kind of thinking about how is that going to wrap around an object, these little more gentle curves up here and the tight little hook at the end of this, that makes a little bit more sense to me intuitively, and it kind of drips out the tip of my pen or my pencil more easily. So that's something that you can consider doing if you want to develop more of a feeling of how lines are going to wrap around the sphere. It's easy when you're thinking about a cylinder. Whatever this angle is, you'll just have something doing that. And that's pretty straightforward. But these I found a little bit less intuitive. And so just mechanically repeating it a few times really helped me be able to visualize it, have it come out the tip of my pencil. I can visualize it when I'm looking at a rounded object. Like, how would that, okay, I can see what I'm doing. So that's something you might want to experiment with. Then what you can do is, as you are drawing a rounded object, you can wrap your contour hatch lines around whatever it is. So they don't have to be parallel with each other. These ones are starting off curved but kind of parallel. And then you can also pivot them around a point. So here I'm intentionally not keeping them all straight and parallel with each other. You can have your lines wrap around an object. If you are wrapping things around imagine you're kind of coming down some tree branch here, and then that tree branch, turns. This area in here, you sort of still get the sense of tone because the lines are close together. But look out on this part here. This, because the lines are so spaced out, your brain starts to read this much more as a bunch of separate lines. So if your hashing lines are fanning out from a point, you now have these big gaps to deal with. So one way of handling that is just to make a set of secondary lines from the outside in. And you kind of just stop when you're kind of roughly approximating the same sort of density of line weight. So if I am trying to do, a series of lines and end up with one there's too much of a gap, I can just backfill that like that. Helps me kind of deal with those, sort of to mind the gap. Something that's instructive, there's all sorts of great art examples and resources that we can now get online. If you just go on Pinterest and type in cross-hatching, you can come up with pages of all sorts of examples of cross-hatching. And you look at people trying this on skin, trying this on flower pots, trying this on all sorts of different surfaces, and just sort of see what you like. You'll find other examples where people are making the square grid. Decide for yourself, do you like the look of that, or do you find it distracting? See what you think about those things by looking at lots of different examples. And so there's lots of really great examples we can now find online. Another thing you can do here is you can cross-hatch on top of curved lines. And generally what people do is you start with sort of your primary lines are bolder, a lighter set on top of that, lighter set on top of that. And if the whole idea of making your of trying to wrap straight lines and curve things around it, around a shape, kind of makes your blood run cold, and you feel that that feels a little bit scary to me. You can also do a whole bunch of shading just by lightly scribbling or darkly scribbling. All right? And what you're doing is trying not to get into too much in one place, but try to get a scribble that is going to evenly fill a space with roughly the same amount of value of darkness, and sort of blur your eyes and kind of look at it and relax. Depending on the lines, these lines are these sort of lines, you get a very different feel if you make little tiny circles or larger ovals, and how do those look? So you can, in your board meeting doodles, you can experiment with what sort of textures you get by kind of overlapping different sorts of lines. On this, if you want to make it darker, you can just go in and add more scribbles in those areas where you want it to be darker. Couple of caveats about sort of filling the drawing with scribbles is if you're doing a large area, you'll get bored with doing it a quarter of the way into it, and your scribbles will become much further apart. and it's not going to look good. Right? Also, there's a tendency when we get into kind of scribbling in an area, you get so into the mechanics of it and kind of hypnotized by the little that at least I lose track of where I'm trying to really get my darks to show up, and I kind of get these big blobs. So it's good for, I find that I make a lot of blobs this way. A lot of people will do this sort of in dark backgrounds. You give them sort of this sort of chaotic pattern. I find also that the scribble hatching is slower. It's slower than cross hatching. I can fill up just the mechanics of doing this are a lot faster, or that with that's a lot faster than going if you are doing this scribble approach and you are trying to fill a large area, it does help to kind of give yourself, sort of break the large project into little pieces. Because if you're trying to do, I'm going to try to scribble this whole area, you'll have a tendency just to do this and then kind of get sick of it. But kind of take this and then work it out into this little zone here. Then in this area here. Then I'm going to do to there. And so you just bite off little pieces. And that is a more effective way to approach doing that. But I find for me, I often get something that's going to go too intensely dark and chaotic. I like the control that I get with putting down successive kind of placed layers of hatching. At this point, are there any questions? Okay. Do you want to take a look at this with some examples? Oh, good, because I made some. All right, so here we go. We're going to take a, you're sitting at Glacier Point in Yosemite Valley, and you're going to make a sketch of the valley in front of you. You pick up your ballpoint pen and you put down a stroke that's the side of El Capitan with great confidence and flair. There's a tendency for, well, first of all, without any other context on the page, the first line that you put down on your page is most likely to be the least accurate, right? Because it's not in reference to anything else. And bam! Now if you put it in with like aplomb, just pow, there's my line, you now have this bold, in-your-face line, and your brain is going to try to make the rest of the drawing kind of match up to this. So you've got a few lines at the start that are really intense. Because you put them down with some gusto, your brain's going to say, those are right because I can't erase. I have to believe they're right. All right? So what I find is at the start of a pen drawing, it's like a blind date. No commitment. You're going to meet each other, kind of get to know each other, and build up a relationship. And if you want to strengthen that relationship, great. But if you decide this was not a really good idea, right? Just be polite and get through, and you can still work your way out of it, right? So no saying I do on the first date, and that is when you're starting your pen drawing, don't go right, and then make everything have to work with this. So I like to start again with my erasable non-photo blue pencil. So that's the Kohl Erase Copy Knot pencil, and not all non-photo blue pencils are the same. So if you've got like the sort of standard Prismacolor non-photo blue pencil that doesn't have an eraser on it, that's not the pencil I'm talking about. That's a great pencil for making your sky blue, but this is the one that we're looking for right here. Thank you. Friends at home, it has an eraser on it. All right, so that round one that you have that says non-photo blue on it, you say, oh, this is the non-photo blue. Oh, no, it's not the erasable one. This one, if you tried to make your sky a rich blue with it, you wouldn't get anywhere because it draws so lightly. And that's why I like it. You can put down the initial framework of your drawing with this pencil and be able to sort of see, can I get from El Capitan over there to the other side of the valley and get all the features and where are they and where am I going to place Half Dome? I put it down here. No, I need it a little bit higher. I'm going to, okay, over here. You can do a whole bunch of sort of repositioning things, and it's so light you don't even have to erase later on. You just are going to leave that framework there. So I will block my drawing out with this light framework. And then as I start to draw, I then stop and I look at that framework and I say, all right, here's my El Capitan, here's Valley, here's Half Dome, here's the other side. Do I need to make my Half Dome higher? Does it need to be over here? Does this side need to be higher up here? I can make all those little changes very easily with just a little mark of my non-photo blue pencil. I work out those proportion problems before getting any ink down. And once I like these, on top of that framework, I'm going to start to rough in the shapes of the major elements in my drawing. At first, focusing on shape. So let's take a look at this. I don't have an example of what this would look like with non-photo blue pencil. We're going to start with, you have your non-photo blue pencil background, and then starting as lightly as I can with this pen, blocking in the locations of my major structural elements. I now stop again and I double check. How's the placement of my Half Dome? How does that relate to the other features that I'm seeing around here? Is this working for me? Because I still have a chance at this point, if I want this to be a little bit taller, I could put it up taller and just do that with a little bit of a heavier line, and people would go like, oh yeah, that's it. So it's still even flexible at this point, even though I can't erase. But if I like this, I now have guidelines that show me the shape of El Capitan, and I can focus with drawing a line to capture the more sort of detailed shape of what I'm seeing there. All right? I'm making my job easier as an artist by cutting the process down into steps. If I try to do everything at once, to place my objects, get the shape of those objects, to have the variation in my line, and the value, and the detail, I'm asking my brain to juggle all these different things. It's going to be hard. But here, I'm just thinking gross shape. If I like that, I can get a more refined shape. You notice there's not a lot of line variation here. That's because my brain gets maxed out as I'm drawing. Right? I was trying to just sort of keep track of, Jack, would you please, on those back mountains, when you get to Half Dome and Cloud's Rest back there, those back mountains out there, let's just use a little bit of a lighter line back there to help them kind of recede into the distance. But I was so wrapped up in what is the shape of Half Dome back here that I couldn't even really do that. My brain has a hard time multitasking. I give it some little task, and it will kind of do that. Right? So because these are very sort of similar line weights, it kind of makes the drawing look a little bit flat. I'm going to use a bunch of other drawing tricks to help pull some depth out of it. I also want to use this as an opportunity to point out a common drawing problem. And I run into this all the time, and this drawing is a good example of that. And I want to be aware of and beware of what are called line adjacencies. And we talked a little bit about this in our last class at the end. But a line adjacency is if I have one object, well, let's take a look at it here. Do you see how this mountain comes along here? And this cliff comes right out to there and down. It's as this cliff comes up and it just kisses the edge of that one back there. That's a line adjacency. If this kisses that, I have, at this point, a lot of visual confusion. I'm making things more difficult for the viewer. they get to this point and what is going on? Is that an object that's going like that and another object that's going like that? Is this here something that is on the top of this part here? All right. Is that something that is behind the other? All right. Or worse, is this a big slab that's pointing up and balanced on the end of this other thing? There's nothing that really tells the viewer that in this sketch here because of that line adjacency. And I can handle that line adjacency in a bunch of different ways. Probably the easiest is if, as I'm setting up to draw, if I look out and go like, actually from this vantage point, those two, that cliff and that little hill back there line up. I'm going to just walk over to the other side of this parking area and sit down here where those things no longer overlap. If I walk down the slope a little bit, right, this cliff will pop up, and instead of being adjacent, I will see this cliff with that other one coming clearly behind it. Or if I go up the slope, I will see that. So just by changing my position, I can avoid that line adjacency. Or what you can do is just fudge it, and even though you're like that, I'm going to draw it as if it's sticking up like that. Or I can try to work around that using some other techniques, which we'll be looking at. Here it's a little bit too late for me because I've already kind of committed to this. But we're going to take a look at how to, I'm hoping by the end of getting some value and hatching in here, that I will actually have this be something that is avoiding as much of that kind of line adjacency problem as I can. First thing I'm going to do is play with my line variation. If I have a line, do this for the people on the camera here, your brain is going to handle lines on a two-dimensional surface the same way it sees lines in 3 dimensions. So here we have a line. Are we focused? All right. To make it tough for you, I'm now going to back up. All right. You see this line, it's big. Your brain says it's close. Because we're used to sort of seeing things get smaller as they go back in space here, right? Your brain, then when you see a big, bold line on a two-dimensional piece of paper, if it's big, bold, your brain thinks, oh, that's close to me. If it's light and small, your brain says, oh, that's far away from me, just by line weight. So by having things that are closer be a bolder line, I can put a sense of depth into my drawing just with how I'm using my lines. And I don't need to do that over the entire drawing, but look at this. Right here I've got a little line that comes down into here. If I strengthen this part of this line here, then this is going to be clearly in front of that. If I strengthen this part of this line here, I don't have to strengthen the entire mountain, but just that part there, people will get to that part of the drawing and go like, oh, this boulder line, that's the part that's in front. I've got a little bit of that here, where you see that this is a heavier line than that one back there, and that is pushing that line back. But you see how that pulls it forward? I want to leverage that effect. So one is I'm going to use line weight. All right? And the second thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put detail into this drawing, but I'm going to put detail into it selectively. Where do we see more detail? Things that are close or things that are far? Close, all right? So detail, those parts of my drawing that are closer to me on my side of the valley, I'm going to be putting more detail in there, a little bit less back here and none back here. So in the foreground, lots of detail, middle ground, less, background, none. So let's take a look at adding a little bit of line variation and detail. Decide where you would reinforce some of those lines, where you would add detail. This is what I did. It's not right. It's not the only way to do it, but this is how I approached it. So look in this area. See that little line get bolder? This part right down here. Detail up in here. I wanted this to stand out in front of that stuff back there, pull this whole thing forward. This I wanted to be in front of that. See how I'm popping some of those little lines in. And I wanted this to be in front of that back there. So this is now a heavier line. So there's a line drawing. I could stop there, or I can also add hatching in on top of this. So if I'm putting hatching in, I'm going to use that idea of contour hatching to show the verticality of the walls on the side of Yosemite Valley. So big, bold, vertical walls over here, going down here. This is a slope that's coming up and then turning up like that. I can show that with a change in line direction. Big vertical walls. This Yosemite Valley runs roughly east-west. And so the north-facing slope is in shade. The south-facing slope is in sun. Kind of an interesting thing with lots of mountains things. If you're in the northern hemisphere, you'll find that the north-facing slopes of mountains, of hills, that's where you find the shade, sort of deeper woods. South-facing slopes are drier, hotter. You can actually see this as you fly over an area in an airplane. Look down with an idea of north and south-facing slopes. So the opposite in the southern hemisphere. Kind of fun to do. So this is the shadow side. This is the sunny side. So I'm also going to bear that in mind. Can you see these hills starting to kind of take form because of the direction of those hatching lines? Also notice how in these back ones, just light treatment, right? Less detail back here. I'm getting more kind of fussy in here, right? Even more fussy in here. With adding value into something, darks and lights, there's two things that I want to keep in mind. One is, as I go sort of down in this picture plane, back into space, right, as I go from out here to further back, I want to go from things, generally, as I go back here, I'm going to start making things lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter. When I get back here, stuff back here is lighter, both my line and my shading. Stuff up here is darker. Now, in this case, I have this sun-drenched cliff over here, so it's not really getting darker. But in addition to sort of thinking about this sort of overall light-dark thing, it's also useful to think of contrast, the difference between light and dark. As I go back in space, close to me up here, on my end, I'm going to have my darkest darks and my lightest lights. And as I go back in space, the dark point and the light point are going to get closer together. So in the furthest back, there's even no contrast at all. So look at, here's my darkest dark up here, here's my lightest light. Next hill back, here's my darkest dark, here's my lightest light. Back here, here's my darkest dark and my lightest light. So if to light, as I go back in space, I'm going to go from dark to light. Right? Now, here's my dark point and my light point. As I'm overall getting lighter, my dark point and my light point are getting closer together as I go back in space. So those two things make sense? So as I drop back there, I'm getting lighter, but these dark, actually, let me do it this way too. My dark point and my light point. Here, far apart, getting closer together, they're the same thing. If I want to increase this contrast even more, I can add cross-hatching, not over the entire thing, but especially in the areas that are closer to me. So without the cross-hatching, notice how I'm using this to really add more contrast up in here. A little bit here, and then none back there. I wanted that waterfall to pop out because it's such a cool feature. So contrast right around that. The way you draw a waterfall, by the way, is you don't draw the waterfall. You draw the rocks around the waterfall. A trick I learned early on by reading Claire Walker Leslie books as a child sitting on my bed, kind of going, oh my gosh, this is brilliant. And Claire Walker Leslie is going to come out and do a workshop with the Nature Journal Club out here. It's going to be really, really, really fun. So, see that sort of greater contrast. See how that pops this out from there? Here, this is, your brain sort of sees this as more flat. This really pulls that slope forward. Now I want to deal with this front section. And if I try to do scribble hatching into the forest down here forest was dark. So that means I have to make this dark somehow or another. But if I try to do that with scribble hatching, it's going to take forever, and I'll also probably just make it too blotchy. So I'm going to use cross hatching down here. And also what happened at this point in my, at this point in my drawing is my little daughter Amelia came into my room. In my studio, I have a little kind of bouncy ball that I sit on. And if I'm sitting on that, she likes to sit on it too and climb up on my shoulders and have me bounce. So she came in, and my primary job right now is being a daddy. And so I could say, like, you go out of my studio, but she was so ridiculously cute that I figured I have to figure out how to fill this space quickly before I get sick of doing this. So cross-hatching was my go-to thing. So here is the approach that I took. For me, because I'm right-handed, it's easier for me to make lines going this direction than this direction. So I just sort of went with my kind of natural kind of hand direction. And I'd say the advantage of this, a couple of things, some things that I kind of liked about this effect and some things that I didn't. One thing that I liked is that because there's all this sort of stroking in the same direction, it makes it feel like there's some kind of unified thing going on over this whole area. Right? So if that means forest, well then this is all forest, that's more forest there, that's more forest there. I think in a number of places in here I got a little bit too hasty and made my lines a little bit too far apart. So parts of this, you actually read this as a bunch of hatched lines instead of an area of tone. That's because, remember, we read it as lines if they're too far spaced apart. We read it as an area of tone when they're a little bit more. So this is probably a little bit less pressure, but more densely packed, would have read a little bit better. But by then cross-hatching this, I was able to kind of solve some of that problem. So there were these cliffs cast shadows across the valley floor. I put those in with cross-hatching, making the second sort of element that came in the cross-hatching vertical, so that they would sort of have some sort of feeling of trees. I think that did a pretty good job of then kind of, okay, yeah, this is forest floor down here. Another problem that I had back here at this stage was notice that these lines coming down the slope were at this angle. These lines there are now at that same angle. Your brain wants to make this into one big continuous slope because both of those lines line up. It'd be better to have, here's this slope coming down here, here's this slope coming down here, here's something else going on or this to be the floor here. But by breaking that up with a little bit of the vertical hatching, that then helps you this be the forest floor again. The last thing that I do is I just look over the whole drawing and say, are there any other places where I could punch in a little bit more value or add a few little details to kind of pop this drawing? In this case, I wanted this to stand out a little bit more. I wanted this cliff edge to stand out a little bit more. And I put in just a little bit more detail into the trees to make it feel more like a forest. I don't have to put a lot of detail into here, but just a little detail, a few little dead trees and snags into the forest, and it starts to feel much more foresty. So here's without, with. So these are sort of last minute corrections. See how making that a little bit darker pops that forward? Oops, not you. The real hard thing to do then is as you start to kind of make these little tweaks, each one you kind of, ooh, I like that, ooh, I like that. So you get a little bit of positive reinforcement from it. And so what it makes you want to do is just to keep going and going and going and going and going. And we have a tendency to not stop. And so the problem is that there's no signal you get saying, look out, you're about to overwork your drawing. We only know after we have totally tanked the drawing by just keeping fussing with it and messing around with it. So I'm now starting into the fussing zone, and I just have to stop. You have to stop before you think you're done. If you think, there's just a couple more little things I could do, that's the danger point, right? Just a little bit more, one wafer thin mint, right? That's what's going to push you over. Right? So just stop. We will, and you'll be much happier. All right? We'll look at one more example, this time with a bird. You can see the non-photo blue pencil in the background. I actually had to come in with Photoshop and enhance the non-photo blue pencil lines so that you can see them on the slide. When you're drawing them in real life, they're visible on your page in front of you when you've drawn them on your paper. The minute you put your dark lines on them, your brain snaps to them, and they don't even really show up very well on a scan. And they completely disappear on a Xerox machine. But on top of that photo blue framework, see, I started drawing this bird lightly. And that's really key. I started off with this thing lightly because it's, before I just had that line saying, yeah, your beak comes down here, I draw this in. I can now look at my bird instead of say, really, how are your proportions? How is this bird feeling together? And kind of going, oh, I don't really like the angles back here. Oh, and we have a big tendency on anything that we think is particularly cool to draw it too big. Your brain will compensate for what you're interested in by making that element in your sketch way too big. That's why we draw people with big heads, hawks with huge toucan beaks. All right? So on this, what's the really cool feature that I kind of got carried away with? Yeah, they do have big beaks, but that's a little bit overkill. These are really cool little birds. This is the pygmy kingfisher. It's this big. I got to hold one in my hand in Rwanda, and it's so light, it was sitting in my palm, and I felt like there's nothing there. They don't have a bill that's quite that big. So what I can do is just come over this by drawing a little bit more heavily. I can reshape part of the back, reshape part of the bill, kind of fine-tune this drawing. If I did that original one hard, I wouldn't be able to do that. But here your brain goes like, oh yeah, this is the bill, and it virtually ignores that other stuff out there. Those become extraneous lines. And just as I had put in contour shading on El Capitan and Yosemite Valley, I can do the same thing on the landscape of a bird. So I can wrap lines around this bird, coming down the back, dropping down the scapular feathers here, wrapping around the breast of this bird. And just as I did in the Yosemite drawing, I can pick out a few lines, accent those lines, get my line variation in there. Here, a lot of the lines have the same weight. Some are lighter, some are big, but by popping in some bolder lines, all of a sudden, it's a much more dynamic drawing, having that range of lines. And I'm getting those by, kind of coming back in there, making sort of several lines, doing that in that space. So this is just a single flick of the pen. This is maybe 3 or 4. And I can come back into those areas and kind of push those lines that I like. When you start to do that, it'll be fun. And you're going to want to do it everywhere. But if those bold lines are everywhere, they're no longer an accent. It's only an accent when it can't be a highlight if the whole thing is highlighted, right? Also notice that to make this thing feel shaggy, I am adding in some little flicks that are, here's the back of the head. The flicks, if you're thinking of, if you're going to say draw the head of a dog's head, you're thinking, well, there are hairs that are thicker down here, and then they're lighter coming out like that. And so people will flick these things out like that. But what you're actually seeing from a distance is not individual feathers, individual hairs. You are seeing the cracks in masses of fur or masses of feathers. So that means actually the cracks go in like that. Instead of being big on the inside, flicking to the outside, they are big on the outside, flicking towards the inside. So I highly recommend the book Alaskan Field Sketches by William D. Barry. He's my favorite artist in the whole wide world. And you look through his things, and he's got a lot of things where he'll just sort of have a few of these little kind of out-to-in flicks. You press harder and then flick in, and it really gives his critters the fur some depth, the feathers some depth. So I recommend checking those out. So I tried to put a few of these little Bill Berry flicks into this thing to kind of give it also a little fluffy character. You can leave it as a pen drawing, or if you want to, you can add color on top of that. So I turned this into a mixed media drawing using both gouache and watercolor. My approach with watercolor is, the thing that's really cool about that, when you're putting watercolor over your pencil drawing, some of the pencil really gets obscured. It kind of lifts out, it gets lighter, and you can lose it. But with a ballpoint pen drawing like this, the quality of your lines, even a lot of your fine lines, is still going to show through. So kind of, you like those lines, you're not going to lose them as much when you put that watercolor on top of it. So when I do my watercolor, my general go-to method is to start with shadows. So when I put the shadows in on this big white bird, it makes it easier for me to think about where do the shadows go, as opposed to putting them on top of something where I already have put in lots of colors and values. The other advantage of that is it's not going to smudge and blend and mess up any details that I put in with those other colors. So I'm not going to smear other paint around. So I'll think of the sunlight's coming from back here. Where would those shadows fall on the bird? All right. I often use sort of a purplish mixture, primarily made out of Daniel Smith's Shadow Violet, and then mixed with whatever kind of gray sludge is sort of sitting dried in my palette. When that dries, I can start to paint right on top of that. So that's just a coat of paint. You can see the shadow coming through. Also notice how those pen lines are still really crisp showing up through that. I haven't lost that pen work. Put the blue, gray on the back. And then these are just such fun birds. Outrageous beak, and it's bright red. I let this dry and then put some gouache on top of it. Gouache is like watercolor, but it's opaque. So that means that with watercolor, if I have a dark thing and I put light watercolor on top of that, it doesn't do anything. That light, because it's all transparent, you see the dark through the light. But if it's opaque, it's like putting white out on something. You can draw light things on top of dark things. So I put a little bit of white highlight into the bill, some white iridescent spots in its cheek, and it had some light patches in its wing. That's all with gouache. And I could just leave it like that. Notice those pen lines showing through nicely. Or, if I really want to cover that, some of those other lines up and kind of get rid of those, I can put a background behind it. So, little pygmy kingfisher. Totally sweet little bird. And that's mixed media using gouache watercolor on top of a pen drawing. This was my go-to approach in Africa. You can see a lot of the pen drawings have this. You can see where look at sort of what is just a pen stroke. You'll see that a lot of these sort of dark lines in here, those are kind of getting their sort of multiple lines to sort of build up those kind of accents around those parts of the birds. See the same thing here. You can get the sense of the texture or the roundness of these birds. The light touch that you can have with the ballpoint pen allows you to get lots of flexibility with what you can suggest just with one coat of pen. And because you're using something that's not going to smear over onto the other page, you can have elements cross over. I wouldn't have the eye of the bird be in the middle, but if you start to cross over the border of those pages, you're going to have things that you can make sort of compositionally much more interesting stories starting to happen. Here, this bird, the comment about it, post hoc putting in a box around there, you can sort of tie this page into this page. It gives you also just sort of so much more room to think on the paper, and that's a lot of fun. If you want a chance to practice this and play with it, this month, 2 Nature Journal Club field trips. Not 1, but 2. On the 24th, I think that's a Thursday, is it a Thursday? It may be. It is, oh good. All right, we are going to the McNear Brickyard in San Rafael, where you will be witness to one of the most amazing migration spectacles on the Pacific coast. As all the Vox's swifts that have been living on the western side of the United States come funneling down in a huge flock and by the thousands churn about in the air before descending into the same chimneys of the old brickyard there to sleep for the night. And you wait for it, and a bird shows up, then there's a flock, then there's a lot of birds, and then there's this swirling mass in the sky, and they're all chirping and twittering and doing their swift things, and then it's just really ridiculously cool. And if you're a Bay Area resident, this is the sort of thing that we should, we have migrations, passing right through the Bay Area, and most people are completely oblivious to it. The hawks are migrating through. The swifts are migrating through. The swifts have a very narrow window, though, because they like to travel in a posse. So we're going to be there, catch that swift migration. This is building up to be a good year, and we're hoping that it's going to be swiftastic out there. A potluck treat to share for lunch, for dinner, and your own bowl and plate. I don't think that there are restrooms out there, and so go before you go. There are, however, restrooms at Black Diamond Mines, and at Black Diamond Mines there are also mines. We're going to have a mine tour. Did you know there were coal mines in the Bay Area? Oh no, that's Pennsylvania. No, it's here in the Bay Area. You get to go cruising around in a coal mine, and it'll be really, really neat. Because it might be rather hot out there, and it's very cool inside those coal mines. And we've got a chance to sort of draw and sketch and paint, have a great potluck lunch at the coal mines, or at Black Diamond's Mine Park, and then we'll get a mine tour and a little bit of sketching afterward. And when you arrive, I will have a sign-up sheet there in the parking lot for people who want to take the mine tour. The mine tour, which we're signed up for, I've got reserved. The only one which we're able to reserve was a 15-person tour. And there are, but you're thinking, I'd better get there ahead of everybody else. There's some other tours that day that you cannot pre-register for, but you can do drop-in. And so for people who don't sign up on our list to be in our, the sort of first 15, we will get those people in who want to do it on the drop-in tour, and just have time our lunch, so that our lunch will start at 12:30 instead of 12, so that those people can be on the tour, finish their tour, and come out and join us. It'll be a ton of fun, potluck lunch, and a chance to play with ballpoint pens should you choose to. And if not, see if there's some techniques that you've seen here that are things that generally you might start to incorporating into your work with graphite pencil or whatever media you like to use. So everybody stop right now and sort of think to yourself, is there at least one technique that I saw here that I'd like to incorporate into my game? All right, everybody decide for yourself what that is. All right. Sometimes being intentional about that and picking that out will actually help you do it. So what is something that somebody's going to add to their game? The cross-hatching and sort of looking for those diamonds in it. Excellent. Anybody else? What? So yeah, hatching to sculpt the form with your hatching. That's really fun. That's really fun. Ashok.
So the one where you draw wide arcs, maybe draw short arcs in the middle between those wide arcs, only halfway. To me, that's a great way to draw here. It never occurred to me that that might be a better way to draw here than trying to draw this.
Oh, yeah. So those... Interesting. All right, so have fun with this stuff. Make it yours and have a ball. Thank you folks for coming. I hope that this workshop was of use.